Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, talking about the wildlife for you, all of you out there in Pest Geek world. This week I wanted to talk about another disease, namely raccoon roundworm, also known as Baylisascaris Procyonis. It sounds like a pretty fancy word, but all it means is the roundworm of the raccoon. So Baylisascaris roundworm is a common genre of worms. And Baylisascaris is certainly a specific one, and then Procyonis means raccoon. So this particular roundworm is associated with raccoons because raccoons are the primary host or carrier. A reservoir might be a better way to host. Probably is not quite the perfect word for it, because raccoons don't seem to be harmed by this particular worm that they're carrying, so they're more of a reservoir, but they're the primary carrier of this particular worm. And given how common raccoons are in the United States, this roundworm is pretty common. And so the research shows, in turn, when they've done surveys, that it occurs pretty much throughout the United States, a little less prevalent in the South. But again, this data is a little bit old, so I'm not sure how much I would particularly trust it. I mean, whenever you're looking at surveys, people like to think of themselves as not being part of that survey, but the reality is, how do you know that your particular feces is not infected? So for all practical purposes, you want to just assume that all raccoon droppings are likely infected with raccoon roundworm. So let me talk a little bit about this particular roundworm and the infection it causes for humans. And I'm getting my information primarily from William J. Murray and Kevin R. Kazakos, their article entitled Raccoon Roundworm Encephalitis. And so encephalitis is a inflammation of the brain. And so that's one of the side effects that is caused by infection with raccoon roundworm, is the worm, as it's moving through your body, gets up into your brain tissue, and then your body's immune response causes a violent inflammation that can cause brain damage. And of course, the worm itself can do its damage as it's chewing its way through your body. This particular article was published in 2004 in the journal Clinical Infectious Diseases on November 15th. And the page numbers are 1484 through 1492. And I believe this journal article, if you care to read it, will be available on, Google Scholar or through a regular web search, because I believe it's a government publication. So it's available at no additional cost for a download. Again, you know what? Those of you who listen to me regularly know that I hate the word free when we're dealing with the government, because it's paid for by our taxes. So it's not free. You just don't have to pay for it again. So Kazakos, if those of you who have been doing any work in the field of raccoon roundworm, is the premier researcher on raccoon roundworm. He's retired now, but when he was working, he was early pioneer in this particular area and did most of the publications on this particular worm have his name on it. So Kazakos, and that's Kazakos, and I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. but he is the man when it comes to raccoon roundworm. I don't know who's picked up the mantle since he retired, but the work he's done has been foundational to our understanding of this particular parasite. So let's delve into this particular disease. I know this isn't pleasant, but one of the concerns that I have in the wildlife control industry is really the sort of cavalier nature that many people in the industry have toward zoonotics. So part of my concern is to raise awareness about some of the diseases and infections that can be available to infect people involved in this business, so that we hopefully through awareness we get a little bit more less arrogance and a little less cavalier attitude towards the work that we're doing, and so people take proper precautions. Because the reality is that if people are protecting themselves, the likelihood of them contracting these diseases is pretty low. Actually, can almost be zero unless something accidental occurs. So it's these diseases are scary. Like when we talked about rabies the last time, now I'm talking about raccoon roundworm. They're scary to be sure, but proper precautions and awareness really eliminates that risk to zero to people who are careful and knowledgeable with what they're doing. So I hope that this is an empowering thing, that scares you enough to change your behavior, but not scares you so much that you just shut down emotionally and not really take to heart some of these things, so that you become perform the practices of being safe all the time and treating animals as disease-carrying organisms. Not that we hate wildlife, we don't, I hope you don't, but that we treat them as potentially dangerous and with respect that we need to have. So let's delve into this raccoon roundworm here. So understand that it's a nematode, and it's a nematode parasite that infects more than 100 species of animals. So even though we call it raccoon roundworm, it's critical that you understand that raccoons aren't the only animals that carry this particular parasite. So the bottom line is, I tell people, look, poo is bad, don't touch that. So whenever you're dealing with feces, because this worm sheds, it lives in the intestines of many animals and will shed its eggs while it's in the intestines, and therefore it comes out through the fecal matter of animals, treat poo as dangerous. And so just because you're not dealing with a raccoon poo at this particular moment doesn't mean that poo doesn't have raccoon roundworm in it, this particular nematode. So when an organism is infected by it, and by infected, we're meaning it's not just harboring it, but the worm has, been able to permeate the intestinal wall and has wiggled its way into other parts of the organism. That organism begins to display some neurological symptoms if the infection is severe enough. And that infection is dependent on how many eggs have been consumed. So a colleague of mine describes it this way. And this is not from the article, but he says what happens is when you ingest the eggs, the stomach acids and intestinal fluids are not necessarily a conducive environment for these roundworms, and so they begin to seek out a better environment, and that's why they permeate through the intestinal wall. And once they permeate the intestinal wall, they may hit the bloodstream and then travel through your body. Now, they may encapsulate in some muscle tissue somewhere, and where you may become asymptomatic. So a lot of people can be infected and not even know they're infected. But for those individuals who have consumed enough eggs and they have a heavy enough load in their body will have a greater immune response reaction. That's where the inflammation comes in. And sometimes those worms will find their way into various bodily organs where they can do damage. They can also enter the eye, where they can actually begin chewing their way through your vitreal fluid in your eye. In fact, if you go to an eye doctor, they may be able to actually see the worms. And where they can actually treat the worms. It's one of the portions of the infection they can actually treat, where they can use a laser to kill the worm in the eye. Now, the damage that the worm has done as it's eating its way through is permanent, but they can stop future damage by the use of lasers. And then if the worms, of course, get up into your brain tissue, that's where the massive brain inflammation can occur, and it can result into severe neurological deficiency, where in a sense you can become a vegetable. For not the most pleasant word to use, but where you really become incapacitated, and in some cases, death will occur. And so this is how it's a serious infection. So when was this particular roundworm and disease discovered? Well, it was first identified in 1984 and 1985, so it's relatively recent to our awareness of this particular infection. And by the time this particular article was written, just to remind you, it was written in 2004, researchers had identified 12 additional cases of people who contracted roundworm infection. These were humans we're talking about, not wildlife. These were humans, with a few additional individuals where they were suspicious that they were infected, but that was not proven. Now, you may think, well, hey, that's not a big deal. I mean, 12 people, maybe 14 to 16 different people in the space of over 20 years. Wow, what's the big deal, Stephen? Why are you being such a heavy about this? Well, a couple of things. One, it's serious. Number two is that it's under-identified, and that is, a lot of these zoonotic diseases are more common than people realize. And I'm not saying that they're like epidemic or anything like that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But that more people have been infected with these things, but they're underdiagnosed because medical physicians and pediatricians are not looking for it. It's not, one of the challenges in medicine is that doctors are taught not to look for zebras when they hear hoofbeats. Why? Because we don't have zebras in the United States. The challenge, of course, is that those of us in the industry, we are more likely to be exposed to a lot of these infections that our doctors are not necessarily familiar with. So you, as a wildlife professional, need to be able to caution clients, particularly with small children, when they have raccoon toilets, do children have access to those areas that are contaminated with raccoon feces? Because kids have a tendency to get their hands into dirt and soil, and if it's contaminated with raccoon droppings and they stick their dirty fingers in their mouth, which kids are wont to do, they could ingest these eggs and become infected. And this is how the vast majority of people who have been infected were infected. They were children working in playing in contaminated areas, and they ingested these particular roundworm eggs. The 12 individuals that he identified and that the authors identified in their article, the vast majority of them were under 18, with most of them actually being less than age 5. However, there were a couple of individuals that were older. One was 17, one even was 21 years old. And so some of these individuals had, like the 21-year-old, you may think that's really weird. Why would this individual be eating raccoon feces? Well, the person had a condition known as a geophagia, which means they like to eat soil. And so that is one of the challenges, that when people have a disability or a behavioral action where they like to eat soil, then obviously they're going to be higher at risk. But most of the people who were ingested these feces didn't necessarily have this problem, although a fair number, as I'm looking at the list, a fair number of them did. Some of them have also a condition known as pica, which is, again, that sort of picking at things. As I recall, it's where they're just always eating eating things that they probably shouldn't be eating. Some of them also had Down syndrome again, so they're people that didn't necessarily have all of their mental faculties available to them, and they would do things that maybe an ordinary child wouldn't do. Nevertheless, there have been people that didn't have Down syndrome who've been infected as well. So one case, as I recall, it was actually children were playing in the soil below a downspout where the raccoon had been defecating on the roof of the building, and the rainwater washed the fecal material down into the gutter and down to the downspout, which then spilled out onto the soil where the child was playing, and the child got infected that way by getting dirty hands, sticking their hands in their mouth, and was infected that way. So it is easier to occur than people realize, particularly raccoons like to defecate in sandboxes. So people that have sandboxes that aren't covered, they can have their children exposed that way as well. And so typically it tends to be children who are at greatest at risk because they're the ones who are least likely to be washing their hands and more likely to be involved in, they're not as fearful of getting into poo, basically. So this is one of the challenges that we have to have. So when you have clients with raccoons and they have small children, you need to be a little bit more aggressive and attentive to be sure that those children are being protected from having access to the raccoon toilet and to areas that the toilet may have contaminated through rainwater that would spread that material over a wider area. So you can see your job is a little bit more complicated than it seems. So let me continue. So how do raccoons become infected? Well, raccoons become infected in one of two ways. Juvenile raccoons typically become infected through the environment itself as they're eating things off of the ground. They'll ingest the eggs in that particular manner. Older raccoons tend to pick up the raccoon roundworm by eating other organisms that are already infected with the roundworm. So as raccoons, as you know, are omnivores, so they eat not only vegetable material, but they also prey on other animals. They will, as they're consuming those animals, whether it's carrion, dead animal flesh or other animals that they capture alive, as they feed on these other animals, those animals may be infected, and therefore they're getting those roundworm eggs into their body through that particular means. So the worm comes in two different genders. It has a male and female. The female, once she begins laying eggs, she can shed anywhere from 20,000 to 26,000 eggs per gram of feces. Now think about that for a moment. One worm who is laying eggs can lay eggs at a rate of 20,000 to 26,000 eggs per gram, not ounce, gram of feces. Now, there's 1,000 grams in a kilogram. Now, how much is a kilogram? A kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So do the math. So if a raccoon defecates somewhere, let's say we'll call it 4 or 5 ounces of raccoon feces, how many grams? So that'd be 1/4 pound. So that would be about an eighth of a kilogram, maybe a ninth of a kilogram. So a ninth of a kilogram out of 1,000. So that would be like 11. It would be like 110 grams times 20,000 eggs. That's a lot of eggs. So one female worm inside that raccoon can shed that much. Now, what happens if the raccoon has more than one worm? Which is likely, because raccoons are great hosts for this particular worm. So the the eggs, when they're shedding, can be enormous, and you're not going to be able to see them because they're microscopic. You're going to need a microscope to see them. So you have to just sort of rely on the fact that poo is bad. Don't touch that. Leave that raccoon feces alone unless you know how you're going to be handling it. Some of the research has found that there have been situations where more than 250,000 eggs, that's 250,000 eggs per gram of feces, have been reported for some raccoon droppings. Now, that's obviously an extraordinarily large amount. Think of it, 250,000. That's an order of magnitude of 10 from the numbers I gave you earlier. So it is huge. And so understand the volume of eggs that we're talking about here are truly epic in this particular regard. So the eggs, once they're shed, become infective in 2 to 4 weeks. There needs to be a sort of an incubation period for those eggs to get to the second stage. However, those eggs can, if they remain in moist soil where they don't dry out, those eggs can remain viable or infective for years, if not decades. So don't think that time alone is enough to kill those particular eggs, because these particular eggs have very strong shells, let's call it, for lack of a better word, we'll call it the shell, that kind of keeps this egg viable for a much longer period of time than other types of organisms. So it's tough when it comes to environmental conditions. However, it is, it's not a rock, it's a living thing, so it is subject to various environmental conditions, particularly drying. So again, as I said, it's moist conditions that the roundworm eggs need, because this was one of the issues that came up during some work that I did. And that was, in light of raccoon roundworm eggs being in raccoon feces and the number of wildlife control operators that were in attics doing cleanouts, why haven't we heard more wildlife control operators becoming infected with raccoon roundworm? And again, some of them may have been infected, but because they're adults and bigger and more cleaner than children would be, their risk is certainly less. However, the other issue is that typically the raccoon roundworms are subject to drying conditions. And as you all know, that attics tend to be dry. They also tend to be very warm. And so it's that combination of dry heat desiccates, which is a fancy word for drying out those eggs. And so it's likely what was happening with many of those situations is that by the time the wildlife control operator entered into the attic and was cleaning out those droppings, the droppings were desiccated out, or at least enough of them were desiccated out that they weren't contaminated, or they were able to protect themselves enough. Because it's not really something that you breathe, although I guess theoretically, if you get enough airborne eggs and you breathed it in and those eggs got onto the sides of your mouth and then you swallowed it, that could be a problem. But they're fortunately large, and so a HEPA filter mask will easily block those eggs from getting into your body. I mean, they're large. They're microscopic, but they're not that microscopic. So the HEPA filter mask is certainly good enough to stop the eggs, hands down. So, but it's likely that the desiccating, drying conditions in an attic prevented a lot of people from being infected with this particular disease. So that's the good news, because the eggs can be killed. And what does it take to kill? And this is a different research piece. This was done by the CDC, and you can look this up on your own. I don't have the reference here in front of me, but I'm doing this from memory. It was a particular laboratory study, and what they did was they took purified eggs. These were eggs that didn't have any type of other organic material. So these were not eggs in the droppings, but these were eggs that had been filtered out. So they're just pure eggs. They had no insulating factors around them, and they put them inside a liquid container and then heated that container a couple of degrees and then looked at the eggs to see when they died. They wanted to find out what was the thermal death point. What was the temperature that those eggs needed to be exposed to kill the eggs? And what they discovered was it required a temperature of 144 degrees for at least a minute. Now you may say, well, that's not very hot at all. No, it's not. It's not very hot at all to kill it. Now, does an attic ever reach 144 degrees? Most of them don't. However, certainly they'll get up to 120, 130, and if it's long enough, that'll dry out. We don't know what those numbers are. How long does it take those eggs to dry out? We don't have any research on that, so don't rely on that. But we do know that 144 degrees for pure eggs, for at least a minute, the eggs will be deactivated. Now, the problem is we as wildlife control operators don't encounter pure eggs. Our eggs are always mixed in with other organic material, which means that organic material can act as an insulator that prevents the heat that we're bringing to bear on those eggs from reaching the eggs. So don't simply stick a thermometer in per se and say, 144 degrees, I'm good. I would go a little bit higher than that. To make sure that you overcome any insulating factors of the material that you're working with. And so my suggestion, and I'll put this into a different podcast, but that you want to be thinking, if you're looking to decontaminate something, you want to be thinking in terms of fire. Fire is the best. So there you're looking at well over 400 degrees. And again, temperature is one thing, heat is another. Temperature is the average of the kinetic activity of those molecules, but heat is the measurement of the energy that's involved. So you need to have not just temperature, but you need to have enough energy there to get through all that insulating material. So I'm a big fan of fire. So always flame whatever you can. I mean, obviously, if something will burn on you, then don't flame. You're not going to use flame in an attic, so don't do that. So if something can catch on fire, don't use flame. But if you're dealing with things like concrete and asphalt and metal, things that you can flame, then flame. Otherwise, you'd have to be looking at something in the relationship of steam. Now you may say, well, I thought the eggs need to dry out. Yes, they do, but understand that if you get the temperature high enough, the temperature itself will kill it. And steam is 212 degrees, and it has a lot of energy that's released once it changes from a gas to a liquid form as it's cooling off. So steam would be another way. You would use steam to clean things that you can't use flame on, is what you'd want to use steam for. You may say, well, Stephen, why don't you just use a chemical to sterilize it? The problem is there's nothing available that will kill the roundworm eggs. Nothing that is registered, I probably should say. So there's nothing you're going to be able to spray that will kill the eggs as they stand. So you may say, well, what about bleach? Well, bleach doesn't kill the eggs. All bleach does is allows you to wash that material away, but it does not kill the eggs. It's sort of like what soap does for your hands. A lot of people think soap kills germs. Soap doesn't kill germs. What soap does is it reduces the surface tension on your hands that allows you to wash the germs away, but it doesn't kill the germs. Now, if you have an antibacterial soap, that's a different thing altogether. I'm talking about just ordinary soap does not kill the germs. All it does is it washes the germs away. Same way, that's what bleach will do. Bleach will allow you to wash those eggs away, but it does not kill the eggs. Now, even if you're flaming something, even if you're using steam, even if you're cleaning off surfaces, understand you're never going to verify that is egg-free. You're not going to do that because you just don't have the scientific capability of determining that it's pure, that it's totally clean. All you're going to say is you have reduced the risk, which would be true. You have reduced the risk. So we want to, again, when we're talking with clients, we want to be sure we don't scare them to the point where they think they have to burn down the universe to protect themselves. We want to be sure they understand that, yes, we're cleaning this, but it's not going to be sterile. We're reducing the risk. Keep your children away from this particular area, and you're going to reduce the risk. Because again, just because you cleaned a particular location today doesn't mean a raccoon isn't going to come in tomorrow and defecate on that same spot again. So that's always going to be a problem. All right, well, back to our roundworm here again. So to reiterate, can you kill the eggs? Yes. You need 144 degrees for at least a minute. Those are the pure eggs. The eggs are also subject to drying from high heat conditions that we would find in an attic or a hayloft that is dry, as long as it's prolonged. But we don't know how long that's going to be. So what this means for you is if you're going to do an attic clean out and you have the raccoons removed so you're not getting any new loads in the attic, then you'd want to push that off to the fall for two reasons. One, it's going to be cooler for you. And number two, it's going to give those eggs more time to dry out, which would reduce the risk for you. Now, you're still going to be using your full gown, your PPE, and all that kind of stuff. So you'd want to make sure you're cautious in this area. But those are the two reasons why you'd want to do that in the fall. Prolonged sunlight will kill the eggs as well. UV radiation kills a lot of different things. So anything that's going to prolong drying is going to kill those roundworm eggs. Can a dog become infected? The answer is yes. The likelihood is that your dog can become infected with raccoon roundworm eggs. And it's believed that dogs can also shed those feces. So here's another reason why when you want to be picking up the crap of your dogs and why you want to be treating dog poo as something that can potentially dangerous as well. As I tell people over and over again, it may sound silly, but poo is bad. Don't touch that. So be sure you're always conscious about that sort of thing when you're working. This is why you want to protect yourself before you start crawling around in crawl spaces and underneath decks, because you don't know what you're crawling through. And you want to make sure you're protecting yourself so you're not going to be exposed. So what happens if a human becomes infected? What are some of the signs? Well, it is very difficult to determine the symptoms of this particular infection. As I said, it does cause neurological symptoms, but those are very vague and they can be difficult to pin down to a particular cause, such as raccoon roundworm. What they do know is that the infection does cause visceral. These are things in your stomach area, neurological and ocular issues. We've already mentioned the eye, the roundworm eating its way through your eye. If you get a severe infection, you can become basically a vegetable. And that is very, very sad. And some people have had that. Sometimes people will develop eye issues, and that's where it's going into the eye. And so it's vague. And this is part of the problem with this particular infection, which is why your doctors aren't going to necessarily be looking for it. It's not something that's going to be high on their list of symptoms or diseases to be looking for. Can you treat it? The answer is yes. There are some ways to treat it. Ideally, you'd want to catch it early. So if you know of someone who has been ingesting raccoon feces or other feces, there is some treatments available. You'd want to have the person taking those anti-worm drugs quickly to try to get that out of their system before those worms begin to migrate elsewhere in the body. And there's, of course, treatments for the inflammation that can result if the worms do begin to move and migrate into the body. Once it starts getting into the brain, things are kind of tough to deal with up there. So we really don't have other good therapies if it gets that far into the encephalitis area, and it's pretty bad. So we want to really focus on prevention. So how do we prevent contracting this disease? Well, Don't put things in your mouth. Make sure you're wearing gloves, disposable gloves, or making sure you're not biting your fingernails, making sure you're using good hand washing practices, making sure you're wearing your respirator, making sure that you're wearing your Tyvek suit, and that you're trying to think about how am I possibly contaminating, getting fecal material on my body, on my clothes, where I could then touch it and then put it to my mouth. So if you maintain clean practices, you should be fine. The problem is we get careless in this business. You go into a crawl space area, you're still wearing your Tyvek shoe, you wipe your hands on the Tyvek, and then you grab a cigarette. Or you wipe your hands on your Tyvek that you haven't taken off and you grab a hamburger. Remember, this is a type of business you want to wash your hands before you use the restroom. Hopefully you're washing them after you use the restroom, but you want to definitively be doing it before you go use the restroom. So you do hand washing, get that grime off your hands, making sure you're wearing gloves. Always be conscious of where you're putting your hands. Are you biting your fingernails? Are you picking your nose? Rubbing your eyes? These types of things. So even if you're not going to get raccoon roundworm infection, there's a host of other diseases that are out there, including ones you can catch from humans when you're touching mucosal membranes, biting your fingernails, picking your nose, because those are ways that diseases can enter our body. Keep these types of things in mind. And so on another podcast down the road, we'll talk about doing raccoon toilet cleanups and the process of dealing with that. Unless I've already done it, my memory is a little shaky at this point. I'll have to look it up. But hopefully this has given you a little bit more insight about this particular worm. If you're careful with what you're doing, the likelihood of you ever worrying about it, contracting it, is pretty small. Just make sure that when you deal with clients with raccoons, you talk to them about children, where the children are playing, and the importance of leaving those areas alone. I'm Stephen Van Tassel for Wildlife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.